Hello, I'm Professor Richard Toye, and this is a interview with Professor David Thackeray, also of the University of Exeter and the Centre of Imperial Global History. And David is the principal investigator on a project funded by the Leverhulme Trust, which is called Parliamentary Empire, British Democracy and Settler Colonialism, 1867 to 1939. So David, can you tell us a little bit about the aims of the project and what you and your co-investigator, Amanda Bain of the University of York, have been up to on it so far?
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. So we're about a year into the project, and our focus is thinking about how Parliament became central to debates about citizenship and British identity during the second half of the 19th century through to 1939. So we're interested in how different groups made reference to British parliamentarism or claimed to represent parliamentary values as a way of promoting their own interests and asserting their rights to citizenship. So we're particularly interested in how marginalised groups in society engage with Parliament through practices like petitioning. So we have two PhD students on the project, and one of them is looking at parliamentary debating societies, which particularly appeal to working men. We're also interested in how various forms of women's parliaments emerge, and also how Indigenous people engage with Parliament as well.
So I wonder if I can pick you up on that latter point, the Indigenous people. I think that there is one of your case studies is connected with the Maori in New Zealand. Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so we've just organised a panel at the NACBS in Chicago. So as part of that, I was speaking about the Maori relationship with Parliament. So that's particularly interesting and unusual because after 1867, which is coincidentally the same year as a major reform act in Britain, Maori men are able to elect 4 Maori MPs to Parliament in different regional electorates. That's unusual in itself as well, because you still have a limited manhood franchise for white men in New Zealand at that time. So what I was doing in that paper was thinking about how the English language press reported the relationship between Maori and Parliament. So although the 19th century is a time in which Maori take great strides to promote their interests in Parliament, and they also set up their own Maori parliaments, particularly Te Kota Hitanga, which is translates as the Unity Parliament. Although they make these great strides, they're very hostile. They're represented in a very hostile way in a lot of the European press, both in New Zealand and overseas. So I'm kind of interested in that kind of disconnect between the strides that Maori are making and then the ways in which the settler press creates a very hostile caricature of their achievements.
And are the Maori also petitioning the British government in London?
Yes, so there's some fascinating examples. In 1882 and 1884, you actually get delegations of Maori who travel to London to petition Queen Victoria. And there's a lot of symbolism behind that because they present the Treaty of Waitangi that was signed in 1840 as effectively based on cooperation between the British Crown and the Maori, and they present that treaty as meaning that the Crown has particular obligations to protect the interests of Maori. So this practice of petitioning has a lot of important symbolic value, although ultimately both these delegations are unsuccessful, and the British government claims that instead Maori should be looking to their own government for redress of their grievances because New Zealand is self-governing.
And is there a point then at which, in frustration, they turn away from seeking recourse within the empire to seeking recourse from international organizations?
Yes, so this was the focus of our NACBS panel in Chicago. We were thinking about when we see a change from people focusing on petitioning imperial authorities to them seeking redress from international authorities. And in the case of the Maori, there's a real turning point in the 1920s. You get a prominent Maori, Ratana, who goes to London around the time of the Wembley exhibition in 1924 to seek to make his case to the British government and the Crown. And he becomes very dissatisfied from the replies that he gets. And what's interesting and unusual about that is he then goes on to Geneva to present his case to the League of Nations. So increasingly from the 1920s onwards, Indigenous groups are focusing on international authorities, first the League of Nations and then the UN, as a way of seeking to gain redress for their different grievances. So in many ways, by the 1940s, they're starting to use the types of human rights discourses which are being promoted by the UN as a way of making their case.
And does that actually have any kind of practical benefits? Does it work out for them? Or, in other words, is the British government sufficiently embarrassed by this to make any improvements, or is the New Zealand government embarrassed? Does it have an effect?
Not particularly, not in the immediate sense, but I suppose its significance is it gives them a new way of presenting their case, which becomes increasingly important with the growth of decolonization and development of human rights discourse more broadly after 1945. But in terms of immediate material effects, it doesn't really have much success.
Mhm. And I think there's a broader part of the project which is to do with parliaments as kind of racialized spaces.
Yeah, so we have a workshop which is coming up at the History of Parliament in London, and just looking through the different papers that we're going to have there, one of the really interesting things was how there's a lot of focus on that question of Parliament as a racialized space. So, for example, we have a paper which is looking at traditions of disruption at the opening of the South African Parliament. And then, yes, there's a lot of interesting kind of proposals that we had on subjects such as practices of gift giving to Westminster by newly independent nations and the kind of ritual of decolonization and the symbolism of decolonization, which is part of those practices.
And what would you say is the contemporary relevance or resonance of your overall project for modern politics?
Well, in many ways, the debates about Parliament and who should be represented in Parliament and in what ways, a lot of those historical debates are really influencing national kind of controversies at the moment. I suppose the main example would be in Australia, where since 2017, when we have the Uluru Statement, there's been a debate about whether the Australian Constitution should be reformed so that there is a Indigenous voice to Parliament, to use the language. So in the last month or so, we have the new Albanese government, which has committed to having a referendum on this question. And in the last few weeks as well, the opposition National Party has stated that it will oppose a change to the Constitution. And what's interesting about this debate about an Indigenous voice to Parliament is we can trace its roots back to the 1930s when William Cooper, an Aboriginal Australian activist, was petitioning George V and asking for there to be an Indigenous representative in Parliament. And when he was doing that in the 1930s, he was again referring back to the Maori Representation Act, which had been passed in 1867. So it's interesting that in 2022, we have these callbacks to the 1930s and the 1860s in terms of how the Indigenous relationship with Parliament is being discussed.
Okay, great. Well, I hope you'll keep us updated with the project as it goes forward. So, David Thackeray, thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Richard.